Hi, welcome to another session of the Houdini Training. My name is Gianvito Serra, and today we're going to be learning a little bit about how to set up multiple UV sets for light mapping and pushing point colors into the actual engine. As some of you may know, obviously in Unreal we can support multiple UV sets. Generally the second UV set is used for light mapping purposes, and the first UV set is used for tileable textures and things of the sort. And obviously we can also access vertex colors inside of points to be able to actually, access them in the shader, for example. Okay. Now, if you remember from previous lessons, UV sets and vertex colors in Houdini are basically just considered attributes. They're no different than any other attribute. Houdini doesn't care what you use them for what its own purposes. UVs and vertex colors are just, vertex attributes or point attributes that can be used for any whatever kind of purpose. Now when pushing this, what I like to show here is just a little bit about how to push some of this data back into Unreal, so that and how to actually then access the data once we actually are in Unreal. Okay, so probably the biggest use case is when we actually want to have a second UV set for light mapping. Okay, and I'll explain that a little bit. If we go back to our column asset and allow editing of content, we have a UV set that we use for we have basically two materials here. One that we use for the actual top caps of a column, and one that we use for the actual body of a column. If we look at the UVs, things look about kind of like this. Okay, let's actually look at them before we actually do the skewing. So we have this area, which is the body, in this area, which is the columns. Okay, well, that's cool, but it's kind of a little bit of in this particular case, it's a little bit wasteful, because I mean, this area, for example, will probably be using a completely different material, and this area over here will probably be using a completely different material. So there is no reason for these UVs to actually be separated out like this. Okay, or the way how they're set up right now is really useful if we're actually doing light mapping, because the nice thing about this setup is that light mapping requires that you don't have overlapping UVs. In this, do not have overlapping UVs. Okay, so let's see if we can actually set this up so that the UVs are overlapping, just because of the purpose that we don't care about light mapping. This is because of the purpose that we want to be able to, we don't care first about light mapping when it comes to the colors. Okay, let's set up light mapping to simply use a second UV set. Okay, I'm not going to modify the column generator to asset, and I'm going to just leave it as is, just generating UVs that are completely non-overlapping. What I'm going to do is to add to this set of operators here some operations to actually start building a second UV set. Okay, so let's begin. The first thing I want to do is to actually get these UVs to overlap, since I don't care about it. I want to be able to just get the maximum possible resolution out of my UVs. So let's go ahead and take a look at two views side by side so that we can see it a little bit better. Okay, and what we'll do is actually put this as our perspective view. Okay, and let's get our environment lighting back in here. Let's see. Here we go. Cool. Actually go and pick up the material too so we can see it. Let's go ahead and set this view as our UV viewport. Okay, so we can see our UVs, same time as we're seeing our shader model. Okay, let's actually go here so we can see these QUVs and we can see the texture. So I want to be able to actually use I want to be able to have the column just use the full space, okay, so that we actually get the full extent of the actual UVs that we have here, okay? So the way how we're going to go about doing that, actually the way how I'm going to do it, I will actually modify the column generator operator, okay, for these purposes. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to mute the transformation node that I used to make it so that the UVs will not overlap, okay? And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So now everything should cover the 0 to 1 space. So we go back over here. It's very hard to actually notice that there is any change, but now if we look at my UVs for let's dive inside here. If we look at my UVs for the actual column, if we transform them or not transform them, this is basically the difference, okay? So I'm going to leave them on transform so they cover the 0 to 1 space. And for the caps, same kind of deal. I'm going to do this so that I actually stay on transform, completely on transform, okay? And I'm going to move the responsibility of having lightmap UVs to the actual outside of the asset, okay? So let's go ahead and save node type. And go ahead and do match current definition, okay? After saving definitions, the first thing that we want to do is to create a second UV set, okay? So that we can actually start setting up a UV set which we can use for light mapping, okay? The way how we can do that is by simply adding a layer sub. A layer sub allows you to grab an attribute like UVs and actually create a new layer and actually have it so that all the UV nodes can operate on a new layer. Okay, so if we go to set the current layer to 2, you will notice that all of a sudden my UVs disappear from the screen. And when I switch to 1, my UVs are still here. It's because when I switch to this layer sub, it's actually working on, it's actually visualizing attributes on a second layer. Okay, so we're starting basically with a blank slate. If we add a UV unwrap, okay, we get some UVs there. I can add a UV layout and then lay them out a little bit better. And then I can add another layer sub to view my 2 UV layers. Okay. If you notice too, if we middle mouse, we now have 2 UV attributes, so UV and UV2, which is cool. So that's some attributes about the number of layers and the current layer. Okay. It's a very simple way to actually get a second UV set started, which can be used for different purposes, such as light mapping and things of the sort, right? By actually using all the UV operations, okay? Now, however, the thing to remember is that what we would like to do is to actually set the second UV layer to be just like the first layer, but with some of the offsets that we added, okay? So let's switch that right now. Okay. So basically what we'll do is that we'll get rid of the layout and we'll leave with the unwrap, which simply creates that second UV set for us. And we're gonna add a attribute swap. The attribute swap allows us to take an attribute, take 2 attributes, and as you can imagine, swap them together. Or if you want to, very simply, just move an attribute to another attribute, or copy an attribute to another attribute. Okay, so it's very easy to simply set it to copy. We'll set it to vertex and just copy my UVs to my UVs too. Okay. Now if we go back here and we switch in between the two, you will notice that now I have two UV sets that are identical. Okay. So next, let's go ahead and add the offsets that we want to do. So we're gonna add a UV transform. And we're gonna set these to the column body. I'm gonna set that to be to scale 0. I believe 0.8, but on the with pivoting from the top, okay, which is a 1. Cool. Maybe just for line mapping purposes, maybe we'll give it a little more, 0.7, okay, which will give more line mapping space to the caps. We'll add another UV transform, and then we then simply set these to the bottom cap, and we scale that one to 0.15, okay, which is actually 0.2, 0.3, I mean, sorry, which is about half of the actual, distance that we travel here. Okay, we'll do the same thing to the top cap. And it's basically just setting up ratios of how much percentage do we want each piece to actually take. So it's going to be 0.3 on the scale, and we are going to make it also pivot. We also want it to pivot from the bottom. Okay, but we want it to translate up a little bit. You can see here the DC cap piece. Actually, looks like we don't, because it was probably already starting at the correct location to begin with. Okay. And the reason why we didn't have to translate the second one is because if we look at just the caps, let me go ahead and actually blast the actual body. If you remember, we set it up so that the bottom cap will take one piece and the top cap will take the other piece. Okay, so they each take 1/2. Okay, so as a result, the transformations that we have here are correct in order to actually put things in the correct perspective. All that we had to do is to scale it to 1/3 of a screen, 2.3%, and this will basically make them take the proper halves of what is left of that 30% of the actual UV space. Okay. If we need to, we can even add a little bit of spacing by just adjusting these percentages just a little bit. Okay. That will make it so that they're not perfectly touching, but they have just a little bit of threshold in between them. Okay, to avoid any kind of light bleeding. Now if we go back to our layers up, you will notice that now I have two UV sets. One that is my overlapping UVs for texturing, and one that is my non-overlapping UVs for light mapping. Okay, and even better, when we get to this UV transform, we don't have to really skew the UVs on this. Let's switch it back to the way they were. We can just set these to only skew the UVs on the actual body. There you go. Now my caps are just normal, and the only thing that skews is these guys. Okay. Very cool. So now if we wanted to actually push these to Unreal, all that we need to do is come in here and to do export and to export an FBX file. Okay, so I'm going to call this one column with 2 UVs. Okay, and I'm going to save my FBX file. Okay, save my scene. And we come to Unreal and we go to the import stage and go ahead and re-import our column with 2 UVs. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this is that we do want to go to these settings and we want to turn off generate lightmap UVs as we're actually already generated them. Okay, so let's say import all. Okay, here is our column. Now if we go and edit our column asset, you will notice that now we indeed have 2 UV sets. Here is our UV1 and here is our UV channel 1, which is used for light mapping. Okay. Unreal Engine will automatically use the second UV set for light mapping. So we are able to now have clean light mapping in addition to actually having the different the UV set that we can use for just diffuse textures. Okay, cool. Okay, now say for example we wanted to also bring vertex colors. Okay, for any reason, something that you may need in the shader, we can also do so by simply passing them to Unreal. In fact, we are already passing vertex colors on this particular shader. If we go to Unreal and we edit the column, you can actually visualize them here. Let's give it a little bit more, let's make something a little bit more noticeable. Okay, say for example we wanted something that made the column darker as it got to the bottom. Okay, so what we can do is to actually set our color to be a ratio of the actual the Y position. Okay, now the Y position goes up to something like the height here. Okay, so we can use the height to actually figure out what that needs to be. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a point VOP. And I'm going to take the position and get the Y component. Okay, and then I am going to also get the bounding box of the object. I have a math here. Okay, so this gets the Y component of the point position. This gets the maximum Y component. And what we want to do is to simply fit the Y value in between the max value to and then force it to 0 and 1. Okay, so basically what happens is that it basically just simply creates a gradient that goes from 0 all the way to 1. Okay, and I'm gonna set this. I'm gonna go ahead and make a vector out of this using a float to vector node. And simply pass that as my color. Okay, so now you see my column has a little bit of an effect which makes it darker at the bottom but lighter at the top. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and export the FBX file with the colors. Okay, and we'll go to Unreal. We can go ahead and actually re-import the vertex colors. Okay, but before we do that, we do want to make sure we change one setting on the re-import options. Okay, if you look down to the actual import options and expand them, there is actually one option that says vertex color import option and is set to ignore. Make sure that you set that to replace. Okay, the other one is override, but what we want to basically do is to actually replace, which is going to use the colors from the FBX file. Okay, so now if we go to asset, we go re-import. Okay, and we look at the vertex colors, we now see that we have the gradient that we created inside of Houdini. Okay, cool. So now that we have the gradient here, we can have a little fun with it. So if we wanted the shader to be affected by the gradient, all that we need to do is to simply bring the colors in here by bringing them in here into the actual shader. So here is the vertex colors. We can pass those as the actual base color, or we could simply multiply the base color with our vertex colors and pass that as our base color. Okay, and we save. We should see the effect of that in here. And here is a little bit of an effect here happening. Okay, not gonna go through the whole setup of the materials again. Just wanted to actually show a little bit here how we can actually bring the two UV sets and the vertex colors in from Houdini. But yeah, just make sure that when you actually do that you actually set up your import options. I'll show that again. Make sure that when you actually are ready to actually bring in import options, that you do remember to, in your import options, to go to the import settings and turn on the vertex color import option to set to replace. Okay, now we have two UV sets and vertex colors right from Houdini, and any kind of operation that we do in Houdini should be reflected immediately here. So if we go back to Houdini and say, for example, we wanted to multiply the effect that we see here by 2, multiply constant, maybe by 0.5 to make it a little darker. All that we have to do is to simply resave our FBX file, go back to Unreal, and at this point we don't have to change any settings since the settings are already automatically set to bring in the vertex colors. So let's just do re-import, and there is your darker vertex colors. Okay, so just to actually recap really quick, we learned how to actually use the layer sub to create UV layers so that we can actually work on two UV layers. And then we learn how to use attribute swap to actually copy settings from one attribute to another. In this case, from UV1 to UV2. Okay, remember we can use them to, you can swap, you can move, you can copy. We then use regular UV operations simply to actually set up our lightmap UVs. And another layer sub to actually go back to our first UV set. Okay, for the actual UV transformation that we're doing at the bottom here. Okay. We then use a point VOP just to actually add some colors, to modify the colors on our mesh. All that we did is just use a VOP that simply got the Y position of the object, the maximum Y position of the object, and then simply fit it into a range of 0 and 1 instead of actually 0 and the max of the object. Multiply that by 0.5 and set that as a color, and then did our UV transformation to actually get the marble to have a pen. Okay, very cool. Alright, so that concludes our lesson, and thank you for watching.